Welcome to the first ever live webinar organized by the Kościuszko Foundation. My name is Marek Skulimowski. I'm the president of the Kościuszko Foundation. Let me welcome our guests and speakers, Professor Bohdan Szklarski and Ambassador Daniel Fried. Professor Szklarski served as a head of American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. That's where we met, at the American Studies Center. I'm a graduate of the American Studies Center and the Department of Political Science at Collegium Civitas in 1997-2007, where he also lectured, graduate and lecturer of numerous American and Polish universities. Welcome. And
thank you. Ambassador
Daniel Fried is the Atlantic Council Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow. In the course of his 40-year foreign service career, Ambassador Fried played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As a special assistant and NSC Senior Director for President Clinton and Bush, Ambassador to Poland, and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, and a friend of the Kościuszko Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
So let me start with the ambassador. Could you present a brief history of the US and the Polish relations from the American perspective? We just had a centennial just like a year ago, so I think it would be worth saying a few words.
What's interesting to me about Polish-American relations over the past century is that through those relations, you can trace rather accurately America's view of Europe, of the transatlantic relationship generally, and America's grand strategy. By the way, I should mention that you left out one important piece of my current biography. I'm a visiting professor at Warsaw University, where I teach a course on this very subject. So we'll go back to 1918 and Wilson's 14 points, which was America's first grand strategy. What's significant is not just point 13 about Polish independence, but that Wilson and his administration look at Poland and an independent Poland as a part of an undivided transatlantic community. And they look at the US. Wilson sees the US as a guarantor of this community through the League of Nations. Now he's open, and the 14 points are open to Germany and even Russia joining this undivided transatlantic community. We didn't know in January 1918 about Bolshevik Russia, not quite yet. But it's a big vision. And I should add that the Wilson administration was prepared to support an independent Ukraine, as well as an independent Finland. We were looking ahead then to a Europe of free nations. Now, it fails spectacularly at Versailles and fails because Wilson is unable to get the US Senate to ratify the League of Nations Treaty. And we go into a period of deep isolationism, which ends up with catastrophe for the United States, for Europe, and especially for Poland. As a result of isolationism and the American sense that we had nothing to do with European security, and European security had nothing to do with us, as a result of that failure, we end up giving Europe to Hitler and Stalin because we're absent. We think the British and French can handle it, and we should have known better. They couldn't, they didn't have the strength. We did, we pulled ourselves out, and that leads to September 1st and 17th, 1939. And we realized the depth of this failure in 1940, when France falls. Third period is the Atlantic Charter. And that's Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, going back to this vision of an undivided transatlantic world. But it's too late. The structure of World War II is stacked against it because we need Stalin to defeat Hitler. It's a catastrophe. And by 1943, you have Walter Lippmann, who had helped draft the 14 points, who is now America's premier foreign policy journalist, beginning to adopt a policy of US commitment to Western Europe, but willingness to deal with Stalin about Central Europe. What he says is, well, neutrality for Central and Eastern Europe is all we can expect. And it's this mindset that the United States takes to Yalta, where we accept the Atlantic Charter on paper through the Declaration of Liberated Europe, but we don't try to enforce it. Maybe it's too late, but it's not a great moment. We are dealing with the consequences of isolationism. Now, Roosevelt is uneasy. He feels this isn't a good enough deal, but it doesn't matter. He accepts it. And by the time the United States realizes what we've done, it's too late. Stalin has drawn the line and the Iron Curtain is in place. During the Cold War, by the 1970s, Nixon and Kissinger have essentially accepted Walter Lippmann's definition of American security in Europe and America's view of the transatlantic relationship. Nixon and Kissinger's theory of détente accepts tacitly that Central Europe is lost, that the Iron Curtain is permanent, and that all we can do as the United States is stabilize the Cold War and aim for peace, but not freedom. Western Europe is part of the free world. Central and Eastern Europe is not. Now, this is the American orthodoxy that was at play when I joined the Foreign Service in 1977. But by 1989, the Poles, with the Poles in the lead, but also the Czechs and Hungarians, history opens up. Poland solidarity overthrows communism and undermines the basis of Nixon and Kissinger's acceptance of the division of Europe. It's no longer divided. Poland, between 1989 and 1993, makes free market democratic transformation work. I was in Poland from 90 to 93. I could see it. And the Clinton administration then debates internally what the United States should do about the transatlantic world now that the Iron Curtain is gone, and now that Poland and the others have made a success of the initial phases of transformation. And I was brought back to Washington and put on the NSC staff, the National Security Council staff. And the debate about NATO enlargement is actually a debate about whether we're going to return to the vision of the transatlantic community as undivided, the 14 points Atlantic Charter vision, or whether we're going to accept the Nixon-Kissinger version that only Western Europe counts and Central and Eastern Europe is essentially part of Russia's sphere of influence. It was not put exactly like that, but believe me, that's what was meant. And the debate about NATO enlargement in the Clinton administration was exactly about this. It was a hot debate. I was in it. And it came out the right way this time. Clinton and a lot of Republicans leaned into NATO enlargement to create an undivided transatlantic community, and EU enlargement followed. We achieved the vision of the Atlantic Charter. We achieved the principles of Wilson's 14 points, and Poland, by the way, helped make it happen. Now that ends up, by the late 1990s, with a stunning success. But this is reality, this is real life, and the debate about the transatlantic relationship has returned. President Trump speaks of America first, and he talks about a kind of neo-isolationism. He likes Poland, but is more skeptical about NATO and is hostile to the European Union. These debates are back. There's not one US vision of the transatlantic relationship. There have been several over the past 100 years. I know where I stand, but the United States has gone back and forth. Poland has played a significant, and in the 90s, decisive role in helping America realize its best strategy and avoid its worst. This debate is back, and I hope that Poland continues to play a major role. Now, there's more to say, but that will do for now, and I look forward to a lively discussion.
Yeah, Professor Szklarski, is there any Polish perspective on the transatlantic relations, especially between the United States and Poland?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. Well, from the beginning is 1918. Yes, and we have President Wilson. That's obviously, that was mentioned, and the 14 points and Polish independence. But from the Polish perspective of, if we see development, not in terms of security independence, but also in terms of economic and social development, there is another American president around the same, not yet president, a politician at the same time, who was probably even more important for the long-term development of Poland, and that would be Herbert Hoover, who needs to be mentioned. And he's ahead of the relief effort for Europe and especially for Poland. They did marvelous things, and quite justifiably, one of the squares in the Royal Way in Warsaw is dedicated to him. So we have the Wilson Square, and we have the Hoover Square in Poland, and both of these men, one current, one future president, played a very important part in establishing a very good, friendly, and well, as we know, the mid-war years not very solid, but that's a good beginning of the relationship. What I find very interesting from that time is that if you go to one of the parks in Warsaw, you will find in the Skaryszewski Park, you will find a statue erected to Colonel House, who is a right hand of President Wilson, who's the negotiator, who represents the practicality of American foreign policy. So there are great deals made at the level of the leaders, but there is a lot of work to be done at the level below. And Colonel House represents that, and recognition of his efforts. I think I'm mentioning him because we're talking Trump, Clinton, Kennedy, and then the Nixon, the relationship. We're focusing on the presidents and the White House. But I think what is most important for the stability and continuity of commitments and certain good temperature of relationship between Poland and the United States within the Euro-Atlantic community is the relationship at the level of Colonel Houses, at the lower level, State Department, Congress. I'm sure we will be talking about this during our discussion. But the very beginning, the idea of Euro-Atlanticism does not really exist at the beginning of the 1918. It's a vision, as Ambassador Fried said, yes? And for us, I think for Poles, it also becomes a myth. There's a certain myth of special relationship between Poland and United States, which we owe to the huge diaspora of Polish diaspora in the United States. And the communist period contributed to this, I think, considerably. I will return to this in a moment. Yes, the Second World War and FDR. Well, we don't have a monument erected to FDR because of Yalta and betrayal. Well, thinking in strategic terms for United States, and this is a permanent issue in Polish-American relationships. America has broad view of the world, strategic perspective, strategic interests. And Polish role is to find its place within that design of the world that America sees. If we don't, or when we don't, then we are marginalized. There is no escape from that. This is an asymmetrical relationship between Poland and the United States. But back to Euro-Atlanticism. The communist period had especially after 1956, yes, we realized in Eastern Europe that the Americans were not, or NATO, they were not going to do anything about assisting East European countries in going their own way. The 1956 was that year which clearly demonstrated it. Even before 53 in East Germany, this was a clear message to Eastern Europe that this the global arrangement was in place and it would not change. That's important. No one expected that the division into blocks would change. So the policy of Polish-American relationships from the American perspective, if I may add to what Ambassador Fried said, was to United States was always trying to drive a wedge between East European countries, or the countries of Eastern Bloc, and Soviet Union. That was the strategic policy of United States, to weaken the bloc. Yes, therefore, the Romania received unusual attention in Washington, and Ceausescu was viewed as almost as a hero by Richard Nixon, as the maverick communist. And this is how Poland saw itself. Yes, we saw ourselves in the bloc as maverick communist country, and I think Washington realized it very well, how to play that chord, how to accentuate, how to communicate to Poles that you're special, you're different, you have a special place in our heart, and we gladly believed in it, whether it was true or not. But always, whenever American presidents came, those kind words about Kościuszko, Pulaski, and you fighting for the same cause, we're sharing values, that was reinforcing that myth that if it were not for the communist bloc, Soviet intrusion, domination, colonization, pick the word you like, we would have been great friends with the United States, strategic partners. So when in 1989, the external limitations, restrictions disappear, we enter the new phase of Polish-American and Polish-Euro-Atlantic relations with very high hopes, partly unjustified high hopes, but the expectations of quick inclusion into NATO, into the Western family of countries, were very high. So when President Bush comes to Warsaw in 1989, even right after the June elections, even before the presidential elections, well, he is hailed. He's viewed as a extremely important political leader. Not the first president to visit Poland. Yes, we had Richard Nixon visited Poland, Jimmy Carter visited Poland, so it was not the first president in Poland, but he came, and we were expecting a lot more than he delivered. This is the first, the moment when we start realizing that Euro-Atlanticism is not just a symbol, it's not just a myth, it's not just an idea, but that is also a practical policy, and it is a function of superpower relations. It is influenced by the way Americans see the world and us in this world. And this is when we start realizing that we need to make an effort to find our niche in that American world. That becomes the raison d'etat of Poland. And this is what we've been trying to do throughout all these years. So when I said that President Bush comes with, well, $100 million for stabilization fund for the currency and like $75 million of direct, well, aid money. And we were talking about Marshall Plan. Well, we were expecting new Marshall Plan. And this, so the expectations are here, the delivery is here. And this becomes a permanent problem in Polish-American and Polish-Euro-Atlantic relations after 1989. Those discussions in the Clinton administration about the enlargement of NATO, when Stroke Talbot and the people close to Bill Clinton came up with the idea of the Partnership for Peace as a step towards NATO. Yes, we in Poland saw this again as thwarted expectations. We wanted inclusion, we wanted a date, we wanted commitment, and instead what we got was some antechamber. Yes, so that was a sobering moment. Another second sobering moment. Yes, did it change the mythical aspect of Euro-Atlanticism? No, it didn't. No, it didn't. No, it didn't or not by much. So then the United States, Bill Clinton became tired with what was going on in Russia, yes, and the decision to include Poland into NATO in the first batch of enlargement took place. That was hailed as a huge success, but not. When you read American literature, you realize that it required hard work. It did not come just like this. When you read Polish literature, or when you talk to Polish policymakers or opinion leaders, even though policymakers sometimes are smarter than opinion leaders, a lot of things in the Euro-Atlantic relations we take for granted. We expect that they must happen. That this is an kind of an obligation on the part of the West to do this, that, and that. So the EU inclusion, well, that was obvious, yes. NATO enlargement, this is obvious, yes. American security umbrella for Poland, this is obvious. That's wrong. I think this is our problem with the understanding of Euro-Atlanticism, that we don't see it as a complicated concept with a lot of interests, diverse interests, which Donald Trump's administration only accentuated the complexity. He demonstrated that nothing can be taken for granted, that American commitment to Eastern Europe and Poland is not really a commitment. He wants confirmation that it makes sense, that it will pay off, and this bilateralism and then transactionism, the things which Ambassador Fried alluded here to, bother us, yes, but we still continue. Now, thank God, I would say, thank God for Russia, that it exists as a threat to Poland, imagined or real threat, because what it does to Polish vision of Euro-Atlanticism, it makes it less partisan. It makes it more unified. Whoever is in power in Poland, and we know how divisive the politics in Poland really is. When it comes to foreign policy, we never had those divisions, or they never manifested themselves strongly, because the fear of Russia is paramount. But we see America as a guarantor, as a protector of Poland, yes. But then comes some sober, not NATO so much. NATO is a different structure. NATO is important because it's American. If Americans were not in NATO, then we would have a problem because of.
Can we at this point turn into an American?
Well,
Ambassador.
Let me just mention one last sobering moment in this piercing. The Americans have to kind of pierce through this inflated balloon of expectations that America is there forever for good with us. When we had this discussion about the EPN law about the Holocaust commemoration in it. Then came the third extremely important and very sobering signal from Washington, because Washington plainly said in open letters, yes, if you don't change the law, if you don't do what we would like you to do, if you don't behave like an ally in your domestic politics, that's an intrusion. We will reconsider. That's what the Department of State spokesperson said. We will reconsider the nature of Polish-American relations. For a country which assumes that Americans are always with us, committed, and they like us, and they love us, and that was a very, very sobering moment, I think, which illustrated that Euro-Atlanticism is not just a myth, it's different interests, that it has economic, diplomatic, security dimension, symbolic dimension, and that we need to talk about this, which is a need for Poland to engage in, and that has always been absent, the discussion about what Euro-Atlanticism means in Poland.
Mr. Ambassador, would you like to comment on any of that has been said?
Sure. I was actually involved personally in the preparation of George H.W. Bush's trip to Poland in 1989. So I can comment on it. I realized the Poles wanted more, but the fact was, Washington in 1989 did not believe that anything would change. At the beginning of 1989, no one in Washington believed that the roundtable talks would have lasting significance. I was then the Polish desk officer, a rather modest, a low-level position. I believed that it could lead to change, and so did the U.S. ambassador in Warsaw at the time, John Davis, but we were the only ones. We were the only ones. So to get Washington to understand how momentous this was a heavy lift. Condi Rice, who was at the NSC then as a director, was enormously helpful. She got it. She was open. She actually listened to me, and I've admired her ever since. But what Bush put on the table and what we did in the subsequent years was pretty significant. $1 billion for currency stabilization, $240 million for the Polish-American Enterprise Fund, and 50% debt relief. The United States gave Poland 3/4 debt relief. Those were big steps. So it wasn't what Poland imagined, but it was significant. And in the end, it was enough. With respect to the Partnership for Peace, you are absolutely right that it was considered a way station and an alternative to NATO membership. And I was there in Bill Clinton's first trip to Europe in January 1994. He went to Prague and met with Wałęsa. He met with Havel. He met with the presidents of Slovakia and Hungary. Wałęsa and Havel rejected the Partnership for Peace as an alternative to NATO membership, and they were right to do so. I said earlier in my remarks that Poland helped shape American policy. Well, it did. And this was one of the ways it did so. I'll tell you what happened after that. Almost immediately after that trip to Prague, I was given the instruction to come up with a new approach. And I was given that by Tony Lake, Clinton's national security advisor, who knew I favored NATO enlargement. So I got a mandate to write a different policy. Wałęsa, speaking, I think, for overwhelming Polish views of Polish society, was right to reject Partnership for Peace as an alternative to NATO membership. I mention this because Poland was making its own history. And in the debate about NATO enlargement, Poland, through Jerzy Koźmiński, the then Polish ambassador in Washington, played an enormously important role putting together the arguments and the coalition which enabled us to achieve it. You are right, Professor, that this was not automatic. It wasn't obvious to Americans. It was a huge lift. It was an enormous struggle within the US administration to do this, but we succeeded.
And this is the problem, because the Polish society and even opinion leaders, the journalists who write about foreign policy, they hardly ever communicated to the rest of the people that this is a task, this is a policy-making process. Nothing happens automatically. That even though American presidents come and say those words about Kościuszko and Pulaski and are embraced by Polish presidents and hugs and kisses and everything, but there is Washington behind it. There is Congress. Yes, there are interest groups in the United States which shape American foreign policy. We have this unnecessary focus on the White House and what the White House says, what the presidents say, and we tend to interpret this, oh, that's done deal. Yes, the president said something, and it's done deal. The quality of coverage of American politics has greatly improved in Poland in recent years. In recent 10 years, I'm following it as an Americanist. I follow this closely, and it has greatly improved. But when politicians start speaking about Euro-Atlanticism and Polish-American relations, they kind of forget about this, and they have this simplified message that this is the friendship, strategic alliance, that they tend to inflate the expectations. I would conclude this brief remarks that on both sides, both United States and Poland have an obligation to handle the expectations properly. Americans must realize that Poland has inflated expectations, and they should be quieting, calming them down. They should be sending a message of moderation, and it's our obligation, our political elites, to do the same, not to inflate the expectations too high, because then all we will meet is disappointment from the relationship between Poland and the United States. And I really don't see it happening. And especially during the Trump administration, who tends to inflate the Polish expectations by telling Poles how great we are, how great our history was, and then the current government in Poland is committing the same mistake as previous governments were doing, putting all our eggs into one basket, that is American baskets, and more American troops. American commitment to Poland is certain, and things like this. And it is not helping the concept of Euro-Atlanticism to become as complex as it really is. And the current administration, I think, to some extent, is playing on these sentiments in Poland, is using them. And, you know, the picture of a Polish president signing some documents, doesn't matter what, but signing a document in the White House at the edge of the desk without not being given a chair, standing up, signing something while the American president is comfortably seated behind in a chair. This is a terrible picture. It's a terrible picture, which reveals that excessive reliance on America as provision of security and whatnot for Poland, and the fact that it was the American side which released that picture is even more interesting. Yes, Ambassador Fried is laughing at it, but
I'm aware of the way that picture was seen in Poland. I would say, in general, I have a pretty high opinion of the way Polish diplomats and Polish leaders handled the relationship with the United States during the NATO enlargement debate. I think it was skillful. I think they actually understood that debate well. Ambassador Kuzminski was a master at working in Washington. He was effective. The foreign minister at the time, there were several, but Olechowski and Geremek understood the Americans thoroughly. I don't disagree with what you say about expectations. I do think that I agree with you on a strategic level that Poland needs to look at both the United States and Europe together. Any American who tells Poland it doesn't need Europe, it just needs America, is not really Poland's friend.
Yeah.
The whole point of Wilson's and the good side of Roosevelt's policy, you know, the Atlantic Charter, and Truman and Reagan, all of that was to achieve an undivided transatlantic community with Poland in Europe and in alliance with the United States. Now, Trump is a particular challenge. He tends to like Poland not necessarily for the right reasons. He, I think, exaggerates even the current Polish government's Euroscepticism. Now, this is not an anti-EU. The government in Poland now is an anti-EU. They may be skeptical about certain things and have their differences. And, you know, happily, we don't have to discuss the judiciary, and that's an issue, that's a different issue, an issue for a different time. But it's not an anti-Europe government. The US administration as a whole is not anti-EU, but Trump is. And this is a problem for Poland because it wants to be close to the United States for sound reasons, and it shouldn't get trapped into simply being Trump's ally in a partisan sense. Now, I must say that the current Polish ambassador in Washington, Ambassador Wilczak, does a sound, good job of maintaining ties with the Democrats as well as the Trump administration. I want to give him full credit because he's avoiding a trap, which is easy to fall into, and Americans have fallen into it before, which is just associating themselves with one side of the political spectrum. And Poland has not fallen into that trap, and I give them full credit. But you're right that there's a challenge here. The United States does have the ability and is in fact doing a lot to help Poland against a potential Russian threat through NATO. But it's wrong to simply look at that relationship bilaterally. Poland needs to look at NATO and it needs to look at the European Union. But I think you're aware of that. And I actually think the Polish government and certainly the Polish opposition as well understand that.
Well, we need to understand that the Euro-Atlantic relations and the security which they give, that they have different dimensions: economic, diplomatic, psychological, symbolic, and military. And I think we are learning how to manage those different dimensions, because and that not necessarily on all of them you have to follow the United States, because Poland, for instance, in the last several years, Poland heavily invested, at least in a declaratory fashion, into relations with China. We were positioning our country as the end of the Silk Road, as the Chinese hub, as the great place through which Chinese businesses could expand into Europe. And when the deterioration of American-Chinese relations came, yes, we did not change the narrative too much. Yes, President Duda was supposed to visit Beijing in April this year, and if you followed the articles and the discussions about that, even among experts, we were trying to pretend that the deterioration of American-Chinese relations just don't exist, that we can deal with the Chinese on our own, separately, individually. I think that was very healthy, in fact, because that was I think this is what Poland needs in the transatlantic relationships with United States. We need to realize that we may have different interests from the United States, and we have the right to pursue those different interests. And sometimes we are played by United States, like that Iranian conference that happened in Warsaw, which suddenly made Poland into the hub of anti-Iranian planning board, and that was unnecessary. But well, I think the Iranians were smart enough not to use it too much against us. Yes, and so. This learning process from 1989 till today, I think it consists of realizing that Polish interests do not have to be compatible with American interests, and that incompatibility of Polish and American interests doesn't mean that Polish-American relations will deteriorate automatically when it happens. The EU relations, for instance, that's a very good example of this. I think we are kind of returning to be more pro-EU in the policies, the current government. Yes, and it is. It may be against the wishes of President Trump, although he never communicated it very clearly, although he's very skillfully playing the card of the Tri-Seas initiative, for instance. That's a nice way of how Americans understand Poland and our ambitions to become the regional leader, although at the same time, but that did not receive much attention in Poland. It seems like President Trump is investing more in Viktor Orban as a Central European leader than in anyone in government in Warsaw. Yes, the fact that the people in government in Warsaw are not the ones who control Polish politics is not helping. Yes, that's too nuanced maybe for Washington sometimes. So. The Tri-Seas initiative, which from the American perspective is rather an economic endeavor. Yes, this is how they are pushing us to understand it. Yes, this is the oil trade, gas trade, and infrastructure buildup. And
isn't it building? Excuse me to interrupt. Isn't it building like an American influence in the region trying to divide Europe? That's what some of us heard, that's a tool to divide Europe between the old and the new EU members. All just like a stimulus program for this part of the European Union.
Well, I've been involved in some of the 3 Cs initiative discussions. So let me answer it this way. Originally, there were some in the Trump administration who looked at the 3 Cs initiative just that way, as a divisive issue, to divide Poland from the European Union. Now, that's a mistaken approach, and it wouldn't lead to any particular result. However, the Americans gradually shifted their policy, and where I work, the Atlantic Council, we've been involved in 3 Cs initiative a lot, and we tried to move the 3 Cs initiative in a EU-compatible, EU-friendly manner. And it's worked, because it doesn't work unless it's part of creating an undivided Europe. The whole point is to build up the infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe so that it is at Western European standards. And it's a way to bring in the United States with the EU and with Poland. So it's been moving in a healthy direction. And I think this is one of the better ideas that the Trump administration has gotten behind. Now, with respect to the professor's point about China, Poland was right to look at China as a source of enormous capital. That may be changing not because of shifts in Polish views, but because all of Europe is beginning to look at China in a somewhat less positive fashion. And I suspect Poland will be part of this shift from an uncritical look at China as a source of capital to a much more critical look at China as a a global competitor. I think the United States would be well advised to work with Europe and develop a common approach to China rather than try to go it alone. Finally, you mentioned Viktor Orban. On an ideological level, some of the hard-edged Trumpistas probably do look at Orban with a great deal of sympathy. The trouble is, Orban has been, and his people have been, much less skillful than Poles at cultivating both sides of the American political divide. As I said, Poles are doing a pretty good job working with the government, keeping ties with the Democrats. The Hungarians seem to be all in on Trump, and the vulnerability is obvious. If Biden wins, the Poles are reasonably well placed to say, to just resume the context they've maintained. The Hungarians are going to have a harder time.
If there is any strategic thinking in Polish view of Euro-Atlanticism, I think there is a good deal of people in Poland thought and still think of Poland as the country that can be a moderator, a country that can be a bridge between United States and EU if things go sour between Paris or Berlin and Washington. This is how I think for a while we saw our role in Euro-Atlanticism, both towards the East, Ukraine, as the kind of a middle ground, a go-between, the communicator, the connecting country. That does not work too well at the moment, yes, with the Ukrainian policy. But I think we are coming back to realizing that we are useful to the United States, not if we are anti-EU, but if we are capable of building bridges and coalitions and maybe spreading the message that would bring those two parties together. Although there are people in the EU who see Poland as a Trojan horse of United States. Yes, up to the point of some of the discussions about not sharing intelligence data with Poland. Not only because of the alleged penetration by the Russian spies, but also because it's like sharing it with Washington and we don't want it. But that's also subsiding, I think, in EU.
Well, I hope so. Look, with the British out of the EU, it would be Poland is well placed to step up. It's one of the large countries in the EU. It's got a view of Russia well informed by history. By the way, when we were designing sanctions against Putin's Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, Poland played a major role in that. So Poland could be stepping up in Europe. Foreign Minister Szklarski, when he was the foreign minister, was adept at doing this, at reaching out simultaneously to the Germans and working with the Americans, and he was also skilled at defining Polish national interests, even when they didn't coincide with American interests, but he would define them and defend them. Now, I have a lot of respect for his skill. My point is that Poland could play a large role in Europe and a transatlantic role, especially post-Brexit. But to do so, it needs to be on good terms with Paris and Berlin through the Weimar Triangle arrangement and on decent terms with Brussels. Look, given the commonality of Polish and American views about Russia and about Ukraine, about the East, in the Polish sense, I think an influential Poland's from an American point of view is a good thing. But for Poland to play that role, it needs to be a good European. And I've got no problem with that.
Yeah, and it needs to understand that foreign policy cannot be a function of domestic politics, that it's an autonomous sphere of politics which needs bipartisanship, and it certainly needs to be severed from the domestic culture wars which we are which we're having in Poland at the moment. You see this from the state, you hear it at the State Department too, yes, when it comes to what they talk about, how they talk about Donald Trump. Now probably Pentagon will join too. Yes, the understanding of foreign policy as not a function, not an extension of domestic politics. This is what always helped Poland, yes, in dealing with her neighbors. And let's hope that this time will return, because at the moment we have a government which rather sees the foreign policy as an extension product, or definitely secondary to domestic politics. Yes, and whether it will change in the near future, well, the presidential elections will determine a lot in that regard.
I should say that the Polish opposition, in its contacts with Washington, has been helpful to Polish-American security relations. That is, there were some in the United States who were willing to say, well, look, if the current government does something we don't like with respect to the judiciary, that we ought to use our military presence as leverage. And the Polish opposition people quietly said, no, that's stupid. As Poles, we support good Polish-American security cooperation. Don't screw around. They were effective, and I think they were absolutely right. So it was a pleasure to see that a kind of bipartisan racja stanu way of thinking prevailed in Poland even today. And it's also, I will say I was happy that both Democrats and Republicans in Congress opposed this rather ill-considered American threat to pull out about 1/3 of our troops out of, from Germany. So bipartisanship can exist even when the politics are hot, as they are in both Poland and the United States.
If you are talking about Germany and pulling out of troops, we have a question: how will the planned reduction of the U.S. forces in Germany impact the transatlantic relations?
Well, I hope this doesn't happen. It's not been officially announced. The opposition to this pullout of troops from Germany has been strong from both Democrats and Republicans, including, by the way, from people on the right who normally support Trump. So I hope it can get shelved permanently. It's not good for transatlantic relations, and it's not, frankly, good for Poland. It doesn't do Poland any good if American-German security relations fall apart. How do you think we defend Poland? It's by having troops in Poland and having bases in Germany to defend Poland. This is serious business. And I found that announcement last week appalling, and I found the harsh reaction against it in the United States to be comforting in a way, hopeful.
Well, but it carries this danger of some people in Poland willing to take it as oh, now this is our moment. Yes, now we can insist on this, demand it, that it happens because we want more American troops permanently stationed in Poland. And obviously that would weaken the Polish role in NATO and in the Euro-Atlantic relationship, because it says relationship with the United States is more important than relationship with EU, NATO, and the Euro-Atlantic community. And but I think the 27 senators, Republican senators, even spoke against it, and it doesn't look like the Department of Defense is interested in doing it. But I don't know if you paid attention to it, but when someone not too long ago mentioned that the withdrawal of nuclear capacity, American nuclear capacity from Germany, some of the more zealous and nationalist commentators in Poland said, yes, bring them to Poland. Yes, it is very simplistic view of foreign policy, which sometimes in the media prevails. But I would agree with you, and that we are not doing bad in terms of sending a message to the West. We're trying to be non-partisan, or as much bipartisan as possible. Just today, we read in the Polish papers that the permanent relocation of American troops to Poland is not likely to happen, but because there is discussion about who will pay and how much, and the SOFA agreement, how the American troops will be treated. I find it very interesting, and I think perhaps good, because it illustrates that symbolic, mythical level of relationship. Okay, that's one thing, but there is practical side, the material, the economic side of this relationship, and we have to learn how to negotiate with the United States. We have to learn how to be tough. We have to learn how to say we are not going to buy the Patriot missiles for that price, or the F-35s for that price. Unfortunately, we've already done it, but it's a learning process, and we've only had 30 years of open relations. So I know I sound like someone who's supportive of everything we've done, which I'm not, but I'm just willing to treat it as a learning curve, and a good thing.
Well, I actually agree with that. I think Poland should not worry about its standing with Washington. It should do what it needs to do and learn, to speak honestly with the Americans. I think that's fine. It's worked out well for both of us. It also, I never thought that this whole business of Fort Trump was necessary. The fact is, 10 years ago, the United States didn't have troops in Poland at all. Now we've got an armored brigade on a rotational basis plus a battalion. That's significant stuff. That's just astonishing if you think about that. We need to do more to have an Article 5 that is a credible NATO defense of Poland in place. But this is a very different world from the one we had 10 years ago. That's progress, and I welcome it. You don't need the symbolism of Fort Trump if you've actually got the plans in place and the people and the material pre-positioned.
And I think it's an excellent thought. I would even extend the period of that we should look at from 10 to 30 years and see from 89 to 2020 how immense progress we've made. And we have not talked about American economic investment in Poland, but which is plentiful, which is steadily coming. And this is also, this networking making it profitable, useful, natural for American, not only diplomats, but businesses to be in Poland. Ambassador Mosbacher is paying very close attention to that we do not spoil that economic aspect of relationship. But we've built very strong foundations of good relations between Poland and Euro-Atlantic community and United States and Germany, and temporary setbacks which are inflated in the press, yes, as things which, terrible things happening, that's a step back, takes us back 30 years, but that's not true. But foreign policy needs to be discussed in sober, less emotional fashion. And for instance, running for the office and saying, I promise you that there will be more American troops. That's stupid. Yes, that makes no sense. And fortunately, it's not happening too often in Poland.
I have a couple of questions on the side. If the gentlemen don't mind, I will start reading them out. I think we've answered some of them, like the withdrawing troops from Germany. but it's another one. Where does Poland today find itself with American relations, specifically on trade and immigration? So we touched the trade a little bit, especially with the present ambassador in Poland, who is very focused on the trade. But immigration, that's another interesting, especially from the historical perspective, it's an interesting aspect.
That's the visa issue. Yes,
that's the final, the most recent one.
Like a rock, and it.
Well, I will give full credit to Ambassador Mosbacher, who got the visa waiver program for Poland. I didn't succeed in that, but she did. And I can tell you, she worked it hard. And she used her political capital and connections in Washington to make it happen. I give her full credit. It is a terrific step. It's a tough fight, especially in an administration which is reflexively anti-immigrant, but she did it. So that's quite an achievement.
But what do you think about this? A little bit of sour note to this. This is an administrative program. In order to stay in the program, you have to maintain a certain level of overstays below like 3%. Yes, and I'm wondering what will happen to it if Poles overstay for too long, too many people, and the administration is facing the need to remove Poland from the program, like it happened to Argentina and Uruguay. And so for some reason, I was thinking throughout the years that the reason why United States was not pushing this more forcibly, because, you know, this was an administrative decision to grant more visas, to have fewer refusals, yes? That could have been done earlier, I guess. But the danger of withdrawing Poland from the program which would produce much worse effects for the Polish-American relations than not being in the program. I studied American soft power and perceptions. I did a research project on with quantitative research project on perceptions of United States in Poland, and generally this is not a very solid base upon which these perceptions are built. There is a lot of symbolism, mythology in it, but there is very little knowledge about the United States that would add to this symbolic, the knowledge part of it. There is a potential for anti-Americanism in Poland and to spike. I don't know what Americans know about Polish perceptions of the United States, how much you in the Department of State or you as an ambassador, when you were sending your memos and your reports to Washington, how much did you focus on that? That would be interesting to hear. I have a question then, yes. And
I have also a question from one of the attendees to the ambassador.
How much do people in the United States actually know about Polish attitudes to Americans, and how much are they willing to rely on what they seem to be like, rather than what they actually are? Well, that's a question.
When I was ambassador, it was 20 years ago, and I followed the polling about Polish-American relations pretty closely. I think that it's a different generation. We have to recognize this.
That's true.
And it's a generation of people who don't have the same emotional attachment to America, because Poland is much more a normal country. It's not under Soviet de facto occupation.
That transpired in the research, the generation difference, yeah.
And I find that completely logical. It's also, in a sense, a good thing. Not that I want US-Polish relations to decline, but I want everything we did for Poland. We did so Poland could be a normal European country. And we have to accept the consequences, is that there won't be that sense of special relationship. However, that said, there's a lot to build on. And the sources of that, look, every European country has an anti-American element within it. But we usually manage pretty well with that. Trump has made it worse, especially in Germany. But I don't worry about the future of Polish-American relations, because I also see objective factors that continue to bring us together.
Exactly. You know, this certain level of anti-Americanism, I think, is written into the asymmetrical nature of Euro-Atlantic relations. As long as Americans understand and are patient with it will not spoil their relationship in the long run. When you have someone who's very sensitive and in the White House and takes any criticism of himself and policy as a criticism of himself, then it creates a problem. So the election in the fall will be also very important for the relationship between Poland and the United States, the November relations, because if Trump, with his view of the world and his way of perceiving the world, stays for another 4 years, yes, that is going to require a lot of patience on the part of European allies, Angela Merkel and whoever is in charge in Poland.
Okay, let me handle questions one by one. So it's one from Sebastian Rejak, a former Polish diplomat, presently acting director of American Jewish Committee Central Europe, NGOs, and the shaping of US foreign policy. Back in the late 90s, when Central Europe's fate was at stake, the NATO aspirations, AJC's voice was heard in Congress, a voice of support for Central Europe. To what extent are the current decision makers in the US listening to NGOs regarding relations with Europe?
First, just for the record, I want to point out that the American Jewish Committee supported Polish membership in NATO strongly, without qualification, without reservation. And they did so early and powerfully. That was a tremendous help, I can tell you, because when we had the Polish American community, the American Jewish Committee, all on the same side, it made the politics of that issue a lot easier. So I am grateful to this day for the AJC's support. The Trump administration tends to listen to its own network of supporters. And that is complicated and difficult, but Congress listens to a far wider network. And given the peculiar nature of the Trump administration, the role of NGOs in keeping transatlantic relations as stable as they can be is awfully important.
And it's extremely important to remember that foreign policy in the United States is not done in the White House only, but it's done in Congress. And as we see in the Trump administration, the White House may not be thinking the same way as the Foggy Bottom and the Department of State, or even Department of Defense. Yes, so this requires certain sophistication on the part of whoever would be doing foreign policy with United States, that you have to use NGOs as your messengers or as supporters. And usually, unfortunately, Poland was not very skillful, I think, in using non-governmental organizations on a regular basis when there was a campaign for NATO enlargement, EU, or the stationing of the troops. The Polish community can get mobilized, yes, but between that, I have a feeling that our presence on daily basis, that is being ready to step in if something happens, is not as great as we would like it to be. And not because people who are responsible for Polish-American relations don't want this to happen, but because that's there's not enough resources, yes, and not enough staff to do this. That requires a very elaborate operation on daily basis. No one will match Israel in that regard, probably for a long time. But I think we have a lot to improve, to be present on a regular basis in the policy-making circles in Washington, including think tanks. Yes, to spread the message, because we have to understand that this is a competitive environment, yes, and different interest groups want to influence American foreign policy, and we should be ready with some strings to pull when someone advocates proposals which we would disagree with and would not consider in our best interest. And to get organized then, it is too late.
It's the second question is, will the tension in the US-German relations affect Poland's bilateral relations with both countries? Gentlemen, who would like to handle that one?
Not necessarily. That is, Poland, I hope, will not try to take advantage of US-German tensions. I think that's a mistake. I think Poland needs good relations with Berlin. I think it can advance its interests very well and not have to try to play Berlin in the United States, play us to gain advantage. I think US-German tensions does nothing for European security and nothing for Polish security. And I think that Poland ought to understand that, I think they ought to support a strong US-German relationship because it actually helps Poland.
No, I couldn't agree more. But this is just another issue like the movement of American troops or nuclear weapons, which some people may see as an opportunity to enlarge our presence or say something against Germany. Fortunately, I think it's not going to happen. It would certainly be a mistake. I agree with Ambassador Fried a lot. And we must understand that the way we look at Polish-German relations, this is the economic dimension of security, Polish security, whereas Polish-American relations are seen more in the military, diplomatic dimension of Polish security. So whatever happens between Washington and Berlin does not have to influence that particular dimension, the economic dimension. We all realize how dependent we are on trade with the West and with Germany as absolutely the leading trading partner of Poland. So from the government, I don't think we should expect any attempt to exploit that tension between Angela Merkel and Berlin and Trump, but from the opinion media on the extreme right hand side, surely yes, you will hear this, but that's a function of democratic media.
Yes, a question to Ambassador Fried. If, as you suggested, Poland could play a role in formulation of American strategy in Europe, a maintenance return to undivided transatlantic community, where do you see Poland's leverages?
Well, it's not so much a question of leverage. It's a question of a commonality of view and Polish expertise. For example, I trust Polish judgment and instincts about Ukraine, because Poland can look at Ukrainian politics and see it, because of Poland's experience a generation ago, Poland's apt to see it in a way that we can't. Poland will look at Ukrainian politics with an informed eye. And so Ukraine's success is very much in Poland's interests. So I trust Polish judgment about this. The question is, can Poland help the United States and Brussels formulate the right mix of policies to deal with Putin's aggression and to support Belarus sovereignty, because I don't think we can expect more, and Ukrainian reforms? This is a natural commonality of interests, but Polish expertise Polish possesses an expertise, and that's what it can bring to the table.
Okay. Well, you have to, 5 years ago, the answer would have been easier and would have been exactly like you formulated. Today, it's a little bit more complicated because Polish-Ukrainian relations soured, and what used to be a natural advantage. That's the key to good relations with the United States, making yourself useful, but not only in terms of buying American equipment, military equipment, or providing Americans with your troops to be sent to different parts of the world, but offering informed judgment, informed opinion, reliable, trustworthy. That is something we used to have, but I'm not sure we still have it in the Polish, in the Ukrainian, on the Ukrainian front. Well, it's a view from, I think we would have to ask people in the Department of State how they see it exactly.
Well, I have a question, I think, to Ambassador Fried. Did you participate in the meeting between Bush and Jaruzelski in July 1989?
I wish I did, but I was too low ranking to go on the trip myself. So I did a lot of the preparations and didn't get to go.
Okay, another one. You said that Bush did not expect changes in January 1989, but Brzezinski published a book, Grand Failure, that talked about failure of communism. So how could you not expect change?
Brzezinski was my professor at Columbia University in the 1970s. And in 1989, I was in contact with him several times a week, all the time. He understood things very well. But most people in the Bush administration, with the exception of Condi Rice, and then President Bush himself, did not expect big changes in 1989. They just didn't believe it. They had grown up and come to positions of responsibility, believing that the Cold War was eternal. Professor Szklarski mentioned 1956. Well, right, that's the date. After 1956, it was assumed that that Yalta Europe was the only possible Europe. And for American officials to take the leap and to understand that Yalta Europe was not the only possible Europe, that there was another configuration possible, took more imagination than most Americans at the time were willing to deal with.
Well, it's interesting to note here that, but when the German reunification discussions started happening pretty fast, yes, it was the American administration that was pushing for the German reunification against some more weary and hesitant attitudes in London and Paris. Yes.
That's exactly right. But what happened was that the Bush administration, President Bush himself, was in Poland in July 1989 and in Hungary. And by the time the Berlin Wall fell, he personally understood what was at stake. And so you had Condi Rice and others like Blackwell and Phil Zelikow at the National Security Council, who by the late months of 1989 understood very well what was happening and were willing to take this leap. And they were ahead of most of the US foreign policy bureaucracy.
That's the difference, the 4 months that make a tremendous difference in the perspective on Eastern Europe in Washington then. Because June, we're first, and this is, we don't know where it will all end up. And we must remember that Americans look at Eastern Europe through the prism of relations with Moscow. Yes, we cannot forget about this. When you're in Warsaw, you tend to think that this is autonomous and independent relationship, but it's not. It is always a part of some bigger puzzle. And in 89 till 91, this was a part of the puzzle of relationship between Moscow and Washington.
Well, with the exception that Poles made their own history from April 1989, roundtables signed, June 4th elections, then the Mazowiecki government coming into power. You know, Poles simply pushed history along and created reality. So they changed the environment in which the Americans looked at things. And then in the NATO enlargement debate, the Poles took their enormous political capital, which they had gained. They earned this political capital, and they then invested it in NATO enlargement, and it was successful. It was absolutely brilliant to watch the Poles do it too. Very skillfully handled.
And a question for Professor Szklarski. I'm surprised that Poland took seriously a threat to withdraw US troops because of IPN law. US has a strategic interest in Poland, so this relationship is not threatened. Any comment?
That was not a threat to withdraw American troops, but that was, I think that what I meant, and if I misspoke, that my mistake, but it was that moment in which we realized that you can't take things for granted, that nothing is automatic, that the relationship between Poland and the United States are an element of a network of other relations, and they do not have to be always better, that there is no linear progress in those relationships, there can be setbacks, and that if Department of State is willing to articulate publicly, not through diplomatic channels, their weariness and hesitation, that was a significant message. But there was no one went further on and saying withdrawal of troops or no, I don't. I think that was in a symbolic way a message. Don't take us for granted. That's how I understand that controversy over the IPN law.
Okay. We don't have any more questions. The time is almost up. If you would like to add something that has been said, I would really appreciate it. We have a few more minutes and we'll conclude the meeting.
Well, I would say this. When the United States regarded Poland as an integral part of Europe, and regarded Poland as important in its own right and not a function of Moscow, our policies usually ended up better for us Americans, for Europe, and for Poland. When we looked at Poland purely as a function of our relations with Moscow, things ended up badly. That's my conclusion, looking at 100 years of US-Polish relations. That's the course I teach at Warsaw University. And I was struck by how much American strategic thinking is revealed through Polish-American relations over the past 100 years. I hope we're through, because now with Poland part of the United Europe, it shouldn't be so critical and the stakes should not be so high. But this discussion was interesting to me precisely because of the importance of Poland in American foreign policy over the past century, over the past 102 years. And I thank you, Marek, for the invitation.
thank you for that you agreed to participate. Thank you so much, Professor Szklarski.
Well, if I were to have some concluding remarks, I would say that what we're witnessing in the Polish-American relations, just as in the Polish-EU relations, we are witnessing the process of learning how to conduct foreign policy, how to weigh different interests, how to understand that a country like Poland does not necessarily have one national interest that everyone has to agree on and support. And in this sense, I see the controversies which occasionally arise on the Euro-Atlantic axis as a positive element of this learning process, that we start disassociating different spheres of politics, diplomatic, economic, security, and that we understand how to play different games on different boards at the same time, as long as we play those games as Poland, not thinking that we are the master player on any of these boards. I think we're in good shape, even when transatlantic relationships seem to be rocky.
I just received a message from a gentleman that we all know, Piotr Erweit, says, "Gentlemen, I want to thank you for a fascinating conversation today. It was a pleasure seeing you all again, though virtually." So let me add the same thing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Szklarski, Ambassador Fried, and all participants. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much.